Hello, and welcome to our next topic of the medieval revival, medieval romance. Not that kind of romance, not the crappy dime novels, not the crappy Hollywood movies romance, romance of the Middle Ages. You'll see what that means in just a couple moments. But first, as a matter of context, this continues our discussion of the medieval revival. That is to say, the way times in the High Middle Ages start looking up after the disaster of the Viking invasions in feudal society. We saw the beginning of this revival during our sessions on the agricultural revolution, how society suddenly began to produce much more crops. So people were healthier, they were better fed, there was population growth, people could form towns and trade again. Part of this time period was the development of the Crusades. The Crusades as a time of adventure, of optimism, after the time of the Dark Ages when people really just had to sit tight and take whatever life threw at them. This bears thinking about because there's a major attitude change that you can actually see in the Crusades. No one would have gone on crusade when the Vikings were attacking. You could never take that risk. You wouldn't take the risk of going thousands of miles from home to launch a war and leave your home to be destroyed by Vikings. You couldn't do that. In the same way, you couldn't have trade during the time of Vikings. But now that the Viking invasions have stopped, people are able to move again. They're able to travel. You see this in merchants. As merchants are able to trade more, merchants can travel. The Crusaders can travel. There's a new attitude in society, a sort of new optimism, you could call it. A sense that life isn't just about sitting tight and taking what comes. Instead, life can be seen as an adventure, something where you can go out and travel. This is also the time when there's more pilgrimage. More people are now making religious journeys. If you think back a moment, this is also a very different attitude from anything we find in Beowulf. Think about Beowulf for a moment. Beowulf was an epic poem. Now, the epic poems are great stories, but there's also an element of pessimism in them. Think about Beowulf. Yes, he's a wonderful hero, but as we've said before, yes, he kills his monsters, but there's always another one. The early Germans lived in a society surrounded by monsters. He kills Grendel. Grendel's mom shows up. He kills Grendel's mom. A dragon shows up. There's a lake of monsters. He kills 9 sea monsters when he's in a swimming contest. And when you're living in a world surrounded by monsters, like the early Germans were, this is a pessimistic world. Well, in a sense, that was also the world of the Vikings, of feudal society. There was the sense that you had to sit tight and see it out. Just try to get through a tough world where there's always a monster that could attack you, whether the monster's Grendel or whether the monster's the Vikings. Life is an exercise in endurance. You just take your best shot and try to live as long as you can. You even see this in the monks. Think about the monasteries, those stone walls that give an image of stability and security. But at the same time, what do they suggest? They suggest that you have to sit tight, stay tough, and try to get through a difficult world. Well, that's coming to a close now. That sort of pessimistic attitude. Instead, you have a new optimism. You have an age of romance. And the romances that were so popular in this time reflect that. The romances, their literature, have this attitude of optimism, of travel. And now, in this medieval revival, when you have an agricultural revolution, when you have the rise of towns and trade, when you have the Crusades, when you have pilgrimage and more travel, this leads to a major attitude change, a time of greater optimism. So, what do we mean by romance? By romance, we mean, basic definition, a narrative, a story. Sometimes it's just written in prose, sometimes it's in poetry, that emphasizes love, courtly behavior. They are often adventures that involve the nobles, the warrior noble class. They involve feudal loyalties, going on quests, love relationships, and they can often have a supernatural element to them. There's an element of journeying, of seeking, of adventure. It's not just a matter of sit tight in a tough world. It's go out and seek adventure. Go out looking for fun. Go out looking for something exciting. And it's a different view of life. It suggests that we see life more as a journey, life as a quest, life as a pilgrimage, or even as an adventure. And this is very different from the earlier Middle Ages when life sucked. And the best thing you could do was sit tight and try to get by. So it's a very, very different attitude. Now, you've looked at a couple of these, the romance of Sir Gawain and the Green Knights. Another story is The Knights, the Lady, and the Falcon. It's a story of Sir Lancelot. Lancelot is off on a quest. He sees a lady. Oh, Sir Lancelot, my falcon has flown into a tree and I am so sad. My husband will be so mad at me. Will you please climb up the tree and rescue my falcon for me? Well, Lancelot, being not only a gentleman, but can't say no to a lady. So of course he does. He leaves his sword at the bottom of the tree, has to take off his armor, I think, to climb the tree. He climbs the tree, he rescues the falcon, and then waiting there at the bottom of the tree is the woman's husband. Aha, Lancelot, I have trapped you. You are unarmed, and now I will kill you. Well, see, that's cheating. That's a very treacherous knight to kill an unarmed man. But Lancelot, being a hero on an adventure, he's not afraid. Instead, he says, fine, you want a piece of me, coward? He jumps down with a huge branch, picks up the branch, clocks the knight on the head, and kills him. And Lancelot goes off on his merry way. So this would be a story of one of these adventures. So think a little bit about some of these knightly values. So here are a couple short clips worth watching of knights taking their vows. Again, this is Hollywood, but it still gives you a little bit of the idea.
A knight is sworn to valor.
A knight is sworn to valor.
His heart knows only virtue.
His heart knows only virtue.
His blade defends the helpless.
His blade defends the helpless.
His might upholds the weak.
His might upholds the weak.
His word speaks only truth.
His word speaks only truth.
His wrath undoes the wicked.
His wrath undoes the wicked.
What is your condition?
I'm servant to the Patriarch.
Yeah, he's one of my servants.
Is he? You were born a servant. Kneel. Every man at arms, or capable of bearing them, kneel! On your knees! Be without fear in the face of your enemies. Be brave and upright that God may love thee. Speak the truth, even if it leads to your death. Safeguard the helpless. That is your oath. And that is so you remember it. Rise a knight!
So in the first one, you have from a very mediocre, I think 90s film, Dragonheart. A knight is sworn to valor, his heart knows only virtue, his might uplifts the weak, his wrath undoes the wicked. Then, this one's much more recent from the Crusade movie Kingdom of Heaven, an even worse movie. A lot of fun, but really bad historically. Again, what are the values? The same values. Speak the truth even if it leads to your death. Defend the helpless. So what are the values of the knight? Tell the truth. Show courage. Be brave. Defend the weak. Now that's interesting. Because where is this coming from? We didn't hear anything about this when we talked about feudal society or German culture. Where are these new knightly values about defending the weak and telling the truth and being brave? What is this knightly code of conduct coming from? This is what is called a code of chivalry. Chivalry from the French word horse, cheval. So chivalry was a code of conduct for the knights who rode on horse. This code of conduct grows out of church attempts to control noble violence, to try and impose a new code of conduct on the nobles. Think back to the Crusades, the Council of Clermont, when Pope Urban II stood before the warrior nobles and said, "Let those of you who were robbers now become knights." You see, there's an implication there. The implication is that a knight is not just a warrior, a violent fighter who's out for loot and gold and glamour. No, a knight has a code of conduct. He fights to defend widows and orphans, and he's brave, and he fights for truth and for God. And so this is part of where the romance comes in. Not that these romances are Christian. These romances could actually be very, very secular. I mean, the romances about Lancelot involve him committing adultery and then end up destroying Camelot. So it's not that these were explicitly Christian romances, but still the attitude of a knightly code of conduct is kind of new and kind of interesting, and it's part of this process of finding a place in a Christian society for a warrior. Fine, you want to fight, you can fight, but here's your code of conduct. Here's what a knight should do. So Lancelot, of course, was a very imperfect knight, and he actually does pay for this in the stories. But there are better knights who are granted greater privileges than he had. So think about the element of questing, of adventure. Think about the difference in attitude from Beowulf, and think about the sense of optimism in these stories, that life is not just about getting by. Life is not about sitting tight and hoping the Vikings don't kill you or someone else doesn't. Now, life has settled down enough that you can go out on a quest, on an adventure, and that you can see life as something more and more interesting than that. It suggests a totally different attitude from these high Middle Ages, from this time in the 1100s and 1200s, right up until the Black Death, where society is more optimistic, where this is a kind of, maybe it's going too far to call it a golden age, but another kind of renaissance almost. And that this optimism is reflected in the stories they tell. This is one of the reasons we study literature. It tells us about society's values and their attitudes. Well, in this literature, you can see a new attitude of optimism in society, a new way of seeing life as a quest and an adventure, and something that you actually have something to look up to. This applies not only to the knightly romances, but even to more religious romances, which we'll see in the next video.